Tsar Nicholas II was the last of the Romanov Empire, murdered along with his family during the turmoil of the Russian Revolution in 1917, insisting on maintaining as far as possible the autocratic rule begun by his ancestors. Nicholas failed to address the grievances of his subjects, and with him fell the Russian Empire. Only just surviving the Russian Revolution of 1905, Nicholas refused to heed the warning signs of a statewide uprising that involved disgruntled peasantry, ignored workers, the disenchanted middle classes, and reform-seeking liberals. The Tsar's legitimacy to rule was further brought into question following unsavory and persistent rumors about just how much influence the odd self-proclaimed holy man Grigory Rasputin had on the royal family and politics, and by the Tsar's unwise decision to take personal command of the army in the disastrous First World War. Obliged to abdicate, the Tsar and his family were shot on the orders of the Bolshevik revolutionary and leader of Soviet Russia Vladimir Lenin, in case he became a rallying point for pro-royalists during the Russian Civil War. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was born on the 18th of May 1868 in St. Petersburg. He was born into the Romanov family, which had ruled Russia since 1613. Nicholas was the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III, and so he became the Tsarevich, or heir to the throne. His doting mother was Empress Maria Feodorovna, the daughter of King Christian IX of Denmark. Nicholas had 2 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters. The heir studied a variety of subjects in the law faculty of the University of St. Petersburg from 1885–1890. In preparation for his reign, Nicholas also spent several years in the army, was educated in religious matters, served on his father's council of ministers, and undertook several tours of the Near East and Asia in 1890 and 1891. Like his father, lived and breathed complacent, extreme conservatism. Nicholas II became Tsar in 1894. Following the death of his father on the 1st of November, his coronation was held on the 26th of May 1896. The role of Tsar was one of absolute monarch, and Alexander had played it to the full. Some hoped that Nicholas might be less of an authoritarian, but this was not to be. The new Tsar quickly dismissed calls for constitutional change as senseless dreams. Nicholas controlled quite literally every aspect of his subjects' lives, and in return, his people were given his devotion to duty, family devotion, and religious piety. The bond between monarch and subject was regularly reinforced by such community appearances as Easter celebrations and other public rituals involving pomp and circumstance. There was, too, an overwhelming emphasis given to the superiority of Russian subjects, compared to of whom there were millions within the Russian Empire. This was a deep flaw in Nicholas' approach to rule, but not as catastrophic a flaw as the one which would ultimately bring his downfall. In Nicholas' world, the Tsar simply was the state. But if, for whatever reason, the people lost faith in the Tsar, then they also lost faith in the state, which could, and actually did, open up the possibility of a regime-changing revolution. Nicholas married the German princess Alexandra Feodorovna on the 26th of November, her title prior to the marriage being Princess Alex of Hesse. Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. The couple had met when Alexandra, then just 12 years old, visited Russia for the wedding of her sister to Nicola's uncle. The couple were attracted to each other, and the young prince gave Alexandra a memento brooch. Next meeting, 5 years later, Nicholas and Alexandra dined and skated together, and the relationship blossomed. The couple would have 4 daughters: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and 1 son, Alexei. Nicholas was a slim man of average height and a pale complexion. His one standout feature was his piercing blue eyes. He possessed a certain calm presence He engaged in few recreations, except hunting in the winter and shooting pheasants in the autumn. He spent at least 2 hours in daily exercise out of doors. For, if he had the chance, the emperor, mild of manner, was tough as old boots. He was indifferent to luxury. There was an ascetic aspect in Nicholas's character, and even on winter nights he left the window open. A devout Christian, he ate simply and drank very little. He particularly liked the music of Pieta. Nicholas was an avid reader, indulging an eclectic taste that ranged from Anton Chekhov to Arthur Conan Doyle, and he often read these works to his family in the evening. Nicholas generally receives unflattering appraisals of his character from historians. He has been described as of retiring disposition and limited imagination. Although he had great personal charm, his character was marred by a sensitivity that inhibited him from openly opposing views with which he disagreed. This habit of saying one thing and doing another in order to avoid confrontation has led to accusations of the son being downright duplicitous. This particular character trait also meant he appointed deferential ministers in his government, and removed those from his entourage who disagreed with him, actions which further isolated the Tsar from the true sentiments of his subjects. Nicholas, despite his eagerness to be seen as a loving father of the people, often made appalling decisions that revealed his almost total lack of empathy. Right from the off at his coronation, when thousands of people were accidentally crushed to death, the Tsar blithely carried on with the celebrations anyway. Nicholas' judgment of the right thing to do in certain situations was influenced by a rather misplaced confidence in his abilities, a situation accentuated by the fact that, through his long reign, few advisers hung around for any length of time, and Nicholas increasingly regarded himself as a ruler tested by time. Russia and the states it controlled within its empire experienced great societal changes during the last quarter of the 19th century. A significant growth in the population led to land shortages amongst the peasantry, which still made up 85% of the total population. Peasants wanted opportunities to buy their own land and complained of high taxes. The economy did not do well in the early years of the 20th century. Russia's army and navy were also suffering embarrassing defeats in the Russo-Japanese War. A burgeoning middle class of professionals, intellectuals, and students all called for freedom of speech and association, and a more constitutional monarchy that better represented the needs and interests of the people. When peaceful protesters on their way to present a petition for reforms to the Tsar were massacred outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, opinion quickly swung against the Tsar. The massacre became known as Bloody Sunday in 1905, and it led to a series of damaging general strikes and protests by all classes of society. The unrest was so widespread that it became known to history as the Russian Revolution of 1905. Nicholas begrudgingly promised reforms, although his first reaction was to shoot down any protesters using the army. A new representative parliament was formed, which included an elected lower house, but Nicholas still kept a grip on government by choosing reactionary ministers and keeping them on a very tight leash. Nicholas could, in any case, veto any new legislation. The Tsar also kept absolute control of the military, the state bureaucracy, foreign policy, and the church. Lingering peasant revolts were brutally quashed, and thousands were imprisoned or sentenced to forced labor. Troublemaker revolutionaries in the cities were exiled. The Tsar, known as Nicholas the Bloody even before the revolution, vigorously supported ultra-reactionary nationalists and anti-Semitic organizations such as the Union of Russian People, which carried out vicious attacks on Jewish people and other traditional scapegoats. Reforms were attempted by the Prime Minister Pieta from 1906. The Stolypin Reforms, although well-intentioned, were not wholly successful. Some richer landowning peasants were better off, and the economy was doing well as a whole, largely thanks to industrialization. But some groups was still not really any better off than before the 1905 revolution. Land shortage was still a chronic problem. Both poorer peasants and factory workers remained dissatisfied with the government. The continued lack of freedom of movement and the prohibition of trade unions. Intellectuals and students still wanted better political representation. On the other side, Royalists very much wanted the Tsar to remain an absolute monarch, and Stolypin was assassinated in 1911 for being a reformer. Communist groups like the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks were divided on policy, but did keep the idea of change at the forefront of Russian politics, an arena which was increasingly beset by a malaise only punctuated by regular assassinations of officials by revolutionaries. Nicholas seemed oblivious to these events, despite the warnings of his advisers and even witnessing firsthand the assassination of Ominously, Nicholas confided to a relative, "I'll never agree to a representative form of government, because I consider it harmful to the people whom God has entrusted to me." Nicholas convinced himself it was his duty to maintain the government system as it was. "I swore at my accession to guard intact the form of government that I received from my father and to hand it on to my successor. Nothing can relieve me of my oath." Most damaging of all to his own future, the Tsar fully believed autocracy was actually the best form of governance. Another area of public opinion the Tsar blithely ignored, even if he was made aware of it, was the perception of a strange Siberian called Grigory Rasputin. This self-proclaimed holy man first gained access to the halls of power because he could seemingly bring relief to the Tsaress Alexei, who suffered from Rasputin may have had no more real effect than a psychological one of calmness on his patient. But the Empress was particularly impressed by Rasputin, and he soon became a seemingly indispensable part of the royal entourage. The problem was that unsavory rumors soon circulated concerning Rasputin. The holy man was really a drunk who indulged in sexual activities with anyone he could get his hands on. So the product of the rumor mill went. Scurrilous magazines and less reputable newspapers published unflattering cartoons and speculated on whether Rasputin was having an affair with the Empress, something most historians regard as being highly unlikely. Most damaging, perhaps, was speculation of just how much influence Rasputin had on political policies. Certainly, when WWI broke out in 1914, rumors began to circulate that Rasputin and the German Empress were working against the interests of the Russian Empire. Nicholas refused to react to the vicious rumors. The Tsar once said of Rasputin, "He is just a good, religious, simple-minded Russian. When in trouble or assailed by doubts, I like to have a talk with him, and invariably feel at peace with myself afterwards." The Tsar forbade anyone at court to speak badly of Rasputin. In addition, members of the Orthodox Church who publicly spoke out against Rasputin usually suffered some negative consequences, such as banishment to a remote monastery. Nicholas' loyalty to Rasputin would have a high price. As the historian T. Hasegawa notes, more than anything else, the Rasputin affair contributed to the catastrophic erosion of the autocracy's prestige. During WWI, Nicholas was exposed as an incompetent war leader, even if he himself had been reluctant to enter this particular conflict. Nicholas' decision to take over as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces in September 1915 meant that he became closely associated with Russia's military failures. These failures included calamitous defeats on the battlefield, disastrous logistical incompetence, and the deaths of over 2 million Russian soldiers. WWI also caused further woes for the Russian agricultural sector and economy in general. Perhaps even worse for Nicholas. While he was at the front playing soldier, the government was essentially left under the guidance of the Empress, and for many, this really meant Rasputin. Certainly, there was a whirlwind of ministerial sackings and appointments, many of which were paid for. It was said royalists saw the damage Rasputin was doing. Or, more precisely, the rumors concerning Rasputin were doing to the reputation of the Tsar. One group of royalists hatched a plot to assassinate Rasputin, and his body, beaten and shot, was discovered in a river in early January 1917. Nicholas was soon to be overthrown for his years of inept rule. As the historian G.L. Free summarizes, military defeat, political incompetence, personal stubbornness, and an adamant refusal to share political power or even consider the question negotiable. All this gradually dispelled the mystique of the Romanov dynasty and even fueled suspicions that Nicholas and Alexandra were themselves traitors. The Tsar was obliged to abdicate on the 2nd of March, 1917, still unable to understand that he, more than anyone, was responsible for the fall of the Romanov dynasty. Noted in his diary, "All around is betrayal, cowardice and deceit." The Russian Revolution of 1917 began with bread riots in Petrograd in March 1917 and quickly escalated when troops of the Petrograd garrison joined the rioters. The revolution and the lack of support for the Tsar amongst the political elite had forced Nicholas' hand. He also abdicated in the name of his son and heir, Alexei. Not grasping that the Romanovs were about to disappear from history, Nicholas chose his brother to succeed him, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, who reigned for just one day as Tsar Michael II. Although he was never officially confirmed as such, the Bolsheviks, who established Soviet Russia following a second revolution in November 1917, ensured that the Russian monarchy was effectively abolished. Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks and the new head of the state, negotiated a ceasefire with Germany in December 1917 and formally withdrew Russia from WWI with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on the 3rd of March 1918. Nicholas might have survived in exile, although it is doubtful if Lenin would have allowed him to leave Russia and stir up opposition to the Bolsheviks. King George V in Britain was Nicholas' cousin, but he balked at the idea of hosting the ex-Tsar, lest his presence stir up a worker revolution there. More importantly than these considerations, Nicholas did not want to leave his homeland. The ex-Tsar once stated, "I'd never leave Russia, I love her too much." Rather, he naively entertained the idea of living a quiet life of retirement in Crimea or Kostroma, which had historical ties with the Nicholas and his family were effectively placed under house arrest. To the very end, Nicholas convinced himself his fall from power had nothing to do with his own actions, but rather he was the victim of a Jewish conspiracy. A nonsensical idea based on fake literature and proven to be so by various official inquiries, including one by At first, the confinement was bearable, Nicholas ruefully remarked. "For have I not been a prisoner all my life?" Plans by extremists to assassinate Nicholas and by his supporters to rescue him were foiled by the Bolshevik authorities. In truth, the Bolsheviks were not quite sure what to do with their prisoner. The high-ranking Bolshevik, Leon Trotsky, wanted to put the ex-Tsar on trial in order to publicly expose his inadequacies and demonstrate why nothing short of a revolution was deemed necessary. The civil war, which followed the November Revolution, though, was going badly for the Bolsheviks, and more drastic action was deemed necessary. The Russian Revolution of 1917 began with bread riots in Petrograd in March 1917 and quickly escalated when troops of the Petrograd garrison joined the rioters. The revolution and the lack of support for the Tsar amongst the political elite had forced Nicholas' hand. He also abdicated in the name of his son and heir, Alexei. Not grasping that the Romanovs were about to disappear from history, Nicholas chose his brother to succeed him, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, who reigned for just one day as Tsar Michael II. Although he was never officially confirmed as such, the Bolsheviks, who established Soviet Russia following a second revolution in November 1917, ensured that the Russian monarchy was effectively abolished. Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks and the new head of the state, negotiated a ceasefire with Germany in December 1917 and formally withdrew Russia from WWI with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on the 3rd of March 1918. Nicholas might have survived in exile, although it is doubtful if Lenin would have allowed him to leave Russia and stir up opposition to the Bolsheviks. King George V in Britain was Nicholas' cousin, but he balked at the idea of hosting the ex-Tsar, lest his presence stir up a worker revolution there. More importantly than these considerations, Nicholas did not want to leave his homeland. The ex-Tsar once stated, "I'd never leave Russia, I love her too much." Rather, he naively entertained the idea of living a quiet life of retirement in Crimea or Kostroma, which had historical ties with the Nicholas and his family were effectively placed under house arrest. To the very end, Nicholas convinced himself his fall from power had nothing to do with his own actions, but rather he was the victim of a Jewish conspiracy. A nonsensical idea based on fake literature and proven to be so by various official inquiries, including one by At first, the confinement was bearable, Nicholas ruefully remarked. "For have I not been a prisoner all my life?" Plans by extremists to assassinate Nicholas and by his supporters to rescue him were foiled by the Bolshevik authorities. In truth, the Bolsheviks were not quite sure what to do with their prisoner. The high-ranking Bolshevik, Leon Trotsky, wanted to put the ex-Tsar on trial in order to publicly expose his inadequacies and demonstrate why nothing short of a revolution was deemed necessary. The Civil War, which followed the November Revolution, though, was going badly for the Bolsheviks, and more drastic action was deemed necessary. The Russian Revolution of 1905 challenged the absolute power of Tsar Nicholas II as ruler of the Russian Empire. Bloody Sunday in 1905 started the year disastrously for the Tsar, when soldiers fired upon an unarmed crowd outside the Winter Palace. Strikes, protests, and mutinies followed, which involved peasants, industrial workers, the urban middle class, intellectuals, students, and elements of the military. The Tsar held on to power by promising reforms and a new representative parliament, but he soon lapsed back into his autocratic ways until he was deposed in the Russian Revolution of 1917. Tsar Nicholas II had reigned over the Russian Empire since 1894, but his right to absolute rule began to be questioned by many sections of Russian society. That society had been changing rapidly through the last quarter of the 19th century. A working class of factory workers had sprung up since industrialization. While many peasants had gained the right to work their own land, the student class had also grown significantly. Then there was the growing number of professionals, such as doctors, lawyers, and teachers. Non-Russians were increasingly calling for better national rights within the Russian Empire. This was particularly so amongst the Finns, Poles, and Georgians, and in the Baltic states. None of the above groups was directly represented in Russia, as legal classification of society into 4 tiers: the nobility, gentry, townspeople, and peasantry. Trouble against the Tsar's authoritarian rule had been simmering away for quite some time, with various public disturbances breaking out against state authority. As the historian C. Reed notes, the army dealt with 19 disturbances in 1893, 33 in 1900, 271 in 1901, and 522 in 1902. Politically motivated assassinations were not uncommon, and claimed victims in the police force, local government, and at ministerial level. The bubbling discontent was raised to boiling point by several new factors from 1901 onwards. The formation of worker unions, led by police officials, an idea of police socialism, which came from Sergei Zubetov, the Moscow police administrator, backfired as these associations hid radicals in plain sight. The global economic slump of 1901 to 1905, which greatly increased unemployment, and Russia's losses in the Russo-Japanese War, further dented the Tsar's prestige and added to the woes of those who called for political and economic change. Actions of protest became increasingly violent. The hated conservative Minister of the Interior was assassinated by a member of the Union of Social Revolutionaries in July 1904. In the first days of January 1905, more bad news came to the Port Arthur, one of Russia's key fortresses and a major naval base, had been captured by the Japanese armed forces. In St. Petersburg, on the 22nd of January 1905, a crowd of workers and their families, led by Father Georgy Gapon, wanted to present to the Tsar a petition for reforms. Gapon had already formed a union of factory workers in St. Petersburg, called the Assembly of Russian Factory and Mill Workers. Gapon's petition carried an impressive 150,000 signatures. The demands included a more representative system of government and greater freedom of speech and press. Workers wanted the right to form trade unions, the end of 12-hour working days, better pay, and insurance against accidents, an all too common occurrence in factories. Workers were not happy with secret police interference in their affairs either. Peasants wanted more land and cheap credit to buy it, a fairer tax system, and better education provisions for their children. The Sunday crowd was unarmed, and many even carried photographs of the Tsar. When the crowd would not disperse, soldiers fired on them as they approached the Winter Palace. The demonstrators were then charged down by Cossack cavalry. Over 1,000 people were killed, and many more were wounded in the incident, which immediately became known as Bloody Sunday. Shock over Bloody Sunday quickly turned to a determination by all kinds of social groups to push harder for change. In case the Tsar was not yet aware of the seriousness of the situation, on the 17th of February, his uncle, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, Governor-General of Moscow, was assassinated when a bomb was thrown into his carriage. Russia, for the first time in its history, was about to experience a prolonged and society-wide uprising against authority. Following Bloody Sunday, a general strike was called in St. Petersburg. Students similarly went on strike, shutting down high schools. The Tsar's ideal image as a just and rightful ruler had been shattered, at least in the cities. As one worker at the Blood Sunday March recorded, "On this day I was born a second time, but now not as an all-forgiving and all-forgetting child, but as an embittered man, prepared to struggle and to triumph." In May, the Union of Unions was formed, led by the liberal Pavel Nikolaevich, a federation of recently formed associations of lawyers, engineers, school teachers, professors, doctors, pharmacists, veterinarians, journalists, feminists, and Jewish activists. This union was born from the League of Liberation, which had been led by Milyakov and called for a representative parliament in 1904. More general and local strikes followed in October. Printers in Moscow went on strike on the 19th of September, and soon other professions joined them. St. Petersburg workers also went on strike. Things really became problematic for the authorities when the Moscow railway workers went on strike in the first days of October. Moscow was the railway hub of the empire, but within days, railway workers in other cities joined the strike, which became hugely disruptive. Other professions, such as coal miners, tool makers, bakers, printers, textile workers, and dock workers, joined in, as did students and intellectuals, not only in Russia but across the empire. By the middle of October, many cities came to a complete standstill. In Moscow, one newspaper reported, neither gas nor electric lights work. A majority of the shops are closed. and the entrances and windows are boarded up with grills and shutters. In various parts of the city, water is available only at certain times. In St. Petersburg, the Soviet of Workers' Deputies was formed. This Soviet, led by Georgy Stepanovich Korstalev-Nosa as chairman and with Leon Trotsky as deputy, began as a central coordinating strike committee and developed into the mouthpiece for the entire revolutionary labor movement. Soviets sprang up everywhere, organizing striking workers at a local level and representing the workers' demands to business owners and local authorities. The Soviets called for change, in particular, an 8-hour limit to the working day. The problem for the revolutionaries, though, was that they had no unified and central organization and no undisputed leadership. The left had been divided since 1903 between the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, and the Mensheviks, led by Julius Marx, two groups who fundamentally disagreed on how broad a membership base to foster and what the best means to secure change in Tsarist Russia was. In the early 20th century, Russia remained a semi-feudal society, even if serfdom had been abolished in 1861. A national census conducted in 1897 revealed that over 85% of the population were peasants. The general population had increased by 300% over the 19th century, and land shortage was a real problem. There were numerous peasant revolts through 1905, as peasants, traditional supporters of the Tsar, if anyone was seized land they believed was theirs by right, since they were the ones who worked it. The peasants dispossessed private landowners of their land, livestock, and implements, often destroying their houses and killing those landowners in the process. Parts of the countryside were soon out of control, particularly in western Russia. So many farmhouses and manor houses were burned. The red glow, the flames created in the night sky, became known as the Red. As with the workers, the peasants lacked both weapons and a centralized structure that could coordinate uprisings into a more serious challenge to the government. As it was, the police and army easily quashed the rebellions, and tens of thousands of peasants were arrested, exiled, or flogged in punishment. On the 14th of May 1905, the terrible news was received at home that the Imperial Baltic Naval Fleet had been destroyed at the Battle of Tsushima in the ongoing Russo-Japanese War. Russia lost 21 ships, including 6 battleships, while the Japanese lost just 3 torpedo boats. Odessa, home of the Black Sea Naval Fleet, experienced eruptions of street fighting amongst protesters, and martial law was declared there on the 15th of June. This was the day the battleship Potemkin, flagship of the fleet, arrived in port. Earlier in June, sailors of the Potemkin had staged a mutiny and taken over the ship. The sailors were tired of the harsh discipline in the navy and poor food, and there had long been tensions between the aristocratic officers and ordinary seamen. Fortunately for the Tsar, the Potemkin mutineers did not fire the battleship's guns at any government forces, and they failed to convince sailors on other ships to join them. The Potemkin sailed off to Romania. There were, however, riots in the military bases at Kronstadt and Sevastopol. Initially, the Tsar wanted to use force to repress the revolution. Detached from the real world in his autocratic cocoon, Nicholas convinced himself it was his duty to maintain the system as it was. I swore at my accession to guard intact the form of government that I received from my father, and to hand it on to my successor. Nothing can relieve me of my oath. Further, the Tsar believed autocracy was actually the best form of governance. Nicholas once confided to a relative, "I'll never agree to a representative form of government, because I consider it harmful to the people whom God has entrusted to me." The Tsar's advisers, including the respected statesman Sergei Veit, persuaded Nicholas of the folly of meeting violence with violence. Since this could surely only end in a countrywide civil war, the Tsar must give some concessions. said his advisers. In mid-February, Nicholas went for the absolute minimum and offered the people an elected parliament that would offer advice to the Tsar and his select council of ministers regarding legislation. When this was rejected as nowhere near what was expected, Nicholas created a list of tame proposals, the August Manifesto. These proposals were, predictably, also rejected by most liberals. The Tsar then saw sense and announced on the 17th of October an amnesty and deeper reform measures, all set down in a document which became known as the October Manifesto. This October Manifesto at least divided the opposition to the Tsar, since the manifesto largely satisfied the more moderate liberals and those in society who were neither peasants nor workers. The latter two groups and certain radicals were prepared to fight on. But Nicholas was aided by the continued loyalty of the police and the return of the army following the end of the Russo-Japanese War. The army remained loyal to the Tsar, and to be sure of this, soldiers' pay was doubled and their food improved. The army was used with the police and secret police as a triple-edged tool to brutally repress opposition. Nicholas' October Manifesto guaranteed certain civil rights for his subjects. There was a greater freedom of the press and assembly. Trade unions, political parties, strikes, and student political meetings were all now allowed. The police and other authorities did keep a close watch on political activities of any kind, and journalists received fines or were imprisoned for anything deemed too radical. Nicholas also created a new parliament, which consisted of the Council of State and the Duma. Half of the upper house members were nominated, and the rest came from the upper classes. Members of the Duma were elected by the general population, although most of the voting was indirect. The Duma would be involved in the creation of all future laws. In effect, the Tsar had promised the people he would become a constitutional monarch. The general strike ended, and the middle classes welcomed a restoration of law and order. Some workers wanted more, and there were several lesser strikes, but the authorities now had the upper hand. Countless arrests were made of troublemaking. The exception was Moscow, where a strike turned into an armed uprising in December 1905. The Tsar's Semyonovsky Guards, armed with artillery and machine guns, brutally repressed the uprising and killed 3,000 civilians. The first Duma met in April 1906, but did not offer very much by way of an independent political body. Since ministers were directly responsible to the Tsar and their powers concerning finance were limited, the Duma became even less representative when the electoral system was altered too greatly to favor better-off landowners. In 1907, the landed gentry might have been appeased, but the peasantry and working class continued to simmer with discontent. In contrast, right-wing supporters of the Tsar were outraged. He should have been made to bow to the masses, and they blamed a Jewish-led conspiracy for bringing about such an intolerable situation. Far-right and anti-Semitic organizations, collectively called the Black Hundreds, sprang up and attacked not only Jewish people but also workers, liberals, and students. The revolution of 1905, then, had failed as a revolution in the sense that it did not replace one power with another. It had been a close thing, though. As the historian C. Reed notes, autocracy was under assault from all quarters, and it only escaped by the skin of its teeth. Despite the warning, Nicholas never saw the precariousness of his position, and he blithely carried on ruling Russia, as he and his ancestors always had done. Pyotr Stolypin was made Prime Minister in 1906, and he wasted no time in employing the police force to brutally repress any lingering revolts across Russia. Stolypin declared martial law in August 1906, rounded up rebels, and had them tried in military courts where appeals were forbidden. Key members of the St. Petersburg Soviet were arrested, and many were exiled from December 1906. After the violence, Stolypin did set about reforming Russia. The health service was improved, and the education system, too. Over the next decade, 50,000 new primary schools were created. Stolypin's land reforms permitted peasants greater freedom of movement. They could now acquire cheap loans to buy land and better equipment, and they could consolidate disparate strips of land they worked into single, more efficient farms. Taxes were reduced, and migration to new farmlands in unexploited places like Siberia was encouraged. Stolypin's reforms were, unfortunately, only partially effective. The Tsar's determination to avoid any deeper reforms, the weakness of the Duma, the unsavory relationship between the royal family and the self-proclaimed holy man Grigory Rasputin, and then Russia's disastrous entry into the First World War, culminated in the violent Russian Revolution of 1917, when the Tsar was deposed and Soviet Russia was established with Lenin as its leader. It was Lenin who recognized that the events of 1905 had been a dress rehearsal for revolution. Pyotr Stolypin was a Russian politician who served as Prime Minister to Tsar Nicholas II. Stolypin ruthlessly quashed anti-rebellions after the Russian Revolution of 1905, but was also responsible for economic, social, and land reforms during his tenure from 1906 to 1911. The Stolypin reforms helped modernize Russia's backward agriculture and education sectors. The reforms were only partially successful and failed to prevent the Russian Revolution of 1917. Tsar Nicholas II had reigned over the Russian Empire since 1894, but his absolute rule faced a major challenge with the January Revolution of 1905, when workers, peasants, and elements of the military all called for political, social, and economic changes and a new representative system of government. The economic slump of 1901 to 1905 and Russia's loss in the Russo-Japan War added to the woes of those who called for change and further dented the Tsar's prestige. On the 9th of January, a demonstration at the Winter Palace was fired upon, leading to the incident becoming known as Bloody Sunday of 1905. A general strike followed in St. Petersburg. On the 4th of February, the Tsar's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, Governor-General of Moscow, was assassinated. Peasant revolts followed. In June, sailors of the battleship Potemkin staged a mutiny at Odessa. More strikes followed in October. The result of the Russian Revolution in 1905 was that the Tsar was obliged to offer a more constitutional approach to governance, which he presented in his October manifesto. Nicholas created a new parliament, which consisted of the Council of State and the Duma. Half of the upper house members were nominated, and the rest came from the upper classes. Members of the Duma were elected by the general population, although most of the voters would do so indirectly. In reality, Nicholas' Parliament, which first met in April 1906, did not offer very much by way of an independent political body, since ministers were directly responsible to the Tsar, and their powers concerning finance were limited. The largest party in the Duma was the Constitutional Democratic Party, often called the Cadets. The Cadets called for land reforms, and did not approve of the Prime Minister Ivan. The Tsar then appointed Stolypin, the new Prime Minister. Stolypin had relevant experience since he had served as governor of the province of Saratov, a hotbed of anti-Tsarist feelings. Significantly for his future reform program, Stolypin also had practical experience in estate management. The new Prime Minister was not popular with a large number of other Duma members, who stoked up several minor peasant revolts and military mutinies, not to mention the odd assassination. Stolypin responded to the crisis of discontent by ruthlessly quashing revolts across the state. He declared martial law in August 1906, rounded up rebels, and had them tried in military courts where appeals were forbidden. Over 37,000 people were found guilty of political crimes. 683 death sentences were dished out on the prime troublemakers by April 1907. The hangman's noose became a common sight in local communities, and was widely referred to as the Stolypin nectar. That August Stolypin survived an assassination attempt, although his children were injured in the attack. The crackdown was intensified, and many revolutionaries left Russia until Stolypin's wrath eased. New elections were held for the Duma in February 1907, with the result that the cadets lost seats at the expense of the far-right and left parties. Stolypin accused the Social Democratic Party of plotting to assassinate the Tsar and dissolve this second Duma in June 1907, with electoral rights altered to favor the landed nobility and the wealthy urban classes at the expense of the peasants and workers. A new Third Duma was formed in November 1907. This was a much more conservative and compliant assembly, so much so that the circumstances of its creation became known as Stolypin's coup. The trick worked, since this Duma endured much longer than its predecessors, lasting until 1912, the maximum period permitted by the Constitution. It became known as Stolypin's Duma, or, more unkindly, Duma of the lords and lackeys, since it ensured the landed gentry, who were more likely to be Tsarist than any other social group, gained vastly disproportionate electoral rights. Tensions remained. Most left and liberal Duma members saw Stolypin as someone only interested in facilitating the Tsar's watering down of the concessions he had promised the revolutionaries of 1905. The Prime Minister did wish to reform Russia, though, and he set about implementing an impressive series of measures that he hoped would drag Russia into the 20th century and help it catch up with other major European powers. In the early 20th century, Russia remained a semi-feudal society. Even if serfdom had been abolished in 1861, a national census conducted in 1897 revealed that over 85% of the population were peasants, that is, 97 million out of 110 million of the Tsar's subjects belonged to the peasantry. The Russian population had increased 300% between 1815 and 1900, thanks to an increase in birth rate. By 1905, the population had risen to 130 million. Peasants were small-scale farmers who worked land held by the local commune, or landless agricultural laborers who worked for their local community or local gentry. Peasants remained tied to their local commune, which was run by village elders, and its common field cultivation. In the commune, land was either inherited or repetitioned based on a family's size. Each peasant family owned a kitchen garden, while the pastures and forests were used by all members of the commune. The typical commune had about 100 households and 2,000 acres of land. Russian society was rigid. There was an official classification, since the government insisted that, by law, every person belonged to one of four groups: the nobility, gentry, townspeople, and peasantry. By the end of the 19th century, some movement from the group one was born into became possible, but it was rare. There were other groups. For example, factory workers in the increasingly industrialized cities, university students, and middle-class professionals, but these were not yet considered worthy of separate categorization by the state. The Russian peasantry suffered from heavy taxes, poor farming methods, antiquated equipment, and, above all, a shortage of land. Peasants also had to pay unpopular redemption dues, that is, compensation to the nobles who had been stripped of their serfs. Back in 1861, in the form of an annual cash payment to the government, many peasants wanted change. In particular, more land, freedom of movement, fewer taxes, and more political rights. In 1902-03, there were massive peasant revolts in two southern provinces, and, as noted above, more trouble broke out for the Tsar. In 1905, Stolypin began his term as Prime Minister with ruthless repression, but he knew that longer-term success required deep reforms in Russian society. change would not be easy to achieve, and Stolypin devoted a good deal of attention to public relations, cultivating the press, and prefacing new laws with explanatory preambles, which he drafted himself. Stolypin's tenure as Prime Minister witnessed a series of significant and lasting economic and social reforms. Starting from November 1906, district assemblies were charged with improving and extending health services at a local level. In 1908, Stolypin created the ambition that there would be compulsory universal education within 10 years. By 1914, this ambition was becoming a reality with the creation of new universities, new secondary schools, and 50,000 new primary schools. Land reform remained the Prime Minister's priority. New laws reformed the way land was distributed. Stolypin realized that if revolutionary disturbances were not going to be repeated, there had to be a new agrarian policy to foster the emergence of a class of yeoman farmers. For this reason, Stolypin's reforms were really aimed at the better-off peasants. As Stolypin himself said, his reforms were for the sturdy and strong. The idea was that if more peasants had property of their own, they would be less likely to want to overthrow the system they were benefiting from. There was much talk of taking land from the nobility's vast estates and redistributing parcels for peasants to farm. But the debate became bogged down over whether there should be compensation or not, and nothing much ever occurred in practice. Instead, Stolypin focused on land held by local communes, and here he was more successful. Following Stolypin's reforms, peasants could rearrange the land they worked from their local commune so that, rather than the separated strips they often worked, now they could consolidate these into a single and more efficient farm. Stolypin cancelled redemption payments and improved the legal status of peasants. Land shortages remained a chronic problem, despite Stolypin's efforts to facilitate loans so that better-off peasants could buy parcels of land and the encouragement given to peasants to migrate to unfarmed yet rich agricultural areas in western and southern Siberia. This migration was permitted by a new law in October 1906, which meant peasants were no longer tied to their local commune and could receive a passport. In short, peasants were now permitted to move and live wherever they wished. Loans were also designed to help farmers acquire better agricultural equipment and so increase the nation's productivity, which was some way behind that of many European states. The agrarian reforms took time to see practical results, because there were reams of bureaucratic red tape to cut through and many legal impediments to overcome. Despite the difficulties, the reforms did begin to show tangible results. Landowning peasants increased from 20% to 50% of the total peasantry. However, 61% of the peasantry remained within the commune system by 1916, and there were some bitter rivalries between those who stayed and those who left the commune but remained in the same village. Agricultural production, thanks to improved equipment and techniques, rose from 45.9 million tons in 1906 to 61.7 million tons in 1913. Over 3.5 million peasants did relocate to Siberia, and 80% of these stayed permanently in the cities. Meanwhile, industrialization continued at pace. The economy grew. Between 1861 and 1913, the average annual growth rate was almost 6%. Stolypin's reforms marked a step forward for Russia, but they fell short of significantly improving the lives of Russia's poorer peasants or creating the yeoman class he had hoped for. As he had described it, Stolypin's wager on the strong did not reap the winnings he expected. Neither did the reforms touch those who worked on the lands of the nobility, nor solve the problem of land shortage for a rapidly growing population. Optimists claim that had Stolypin continued in office beyond 1911, his reforms might have borne more fruit. In contrast, Pessimists claimed that the changes had not gone far enough, since, in economic terms, the direct results of the Stolypin land reforms were quite modest, and, further, they failed to demonstrate that newly enclosed private farms were significantly more or less productive or profitable than communes. As the historian Attard summarizes, though they peasants experienced no marked improvement in their economic position from 1875 to 1914, they did not suffer any significant deterioration either. However, many continued to suffer from heavy burdens of debt, and their tradition of subdividing their holdings did nothing to reduce the pressure of land shortage. Stolypin had an uneasy relationship with the Tsar. Nicholas liked people who agreed with him, but Stolypin was vocal about, for example, his disapproval of reactionary groups, like the Union of the Russian People, which committed atrocities against Jewish people in a series of pogroms. When Stolypin attempted to bring the worst perpetrators to justice, the Tsar refused to accept the judicial verdicts. Stolypin had also shown via an inquirer that rumors that Jewish groups were plotting to take over Russia were nonsense, an idea the Tsar was keen to believe in. Stolypin, as part of his desire for greater religious toleration, had even wanted to give Jewish people Russian citizenship, but the Tsar vetoed the proposal. Another wedge between the Tsar and his prime minister was Stolypin's ignored advice that Nicholas remove from the court the decidedly odd monk and faith healer Grigory Rasputin, around whom all manner of outrageous rumors swirled. By 1911, Stolypin's political career was in demise, not only because of his increasingly tense relationship with the Tsar, but ironically, because he was suspected by radicals of helping the Tsar avoid fulfilling the promises he had made to end the revolution in 1905. Stolypin was, therefore, caught between two camps: radicals who thought he was not doing enough to change Russia, and conservatives who saw him as too powerful and determined to undermine the traditional authority of the Tsar. Stolypin was assassinated on the 1st of September 1911 by a socialist revolutionary and police agent. Bogrov fatally shot Stolypin twice when he attended a theatre performance in Kiev. Tsar Nicholas was present that night, and he had heard the shots, but he did not heed the bells of warning such a bold assassination rang. Bogrov was hanged 10 days later. Revolution and unrest continued to blight the Tsar's autocratic reign. The catastrophic effects of the First World War caused further woes for the Russian agricultural sector and economy in general. Once again, Nicholas was exposed as an incompetent war leader. The ultimate result of all of this strife was the Russian Revolution of 1917, which finally toppled. Soviet Russia was established, with Vladimir Lenin as its leader. Nicholas II and his family were executed in July 1918. Stolypin's reforms turned out to be a brief blip in the communal farming normality of the Russian peasantry as the communist Bolsheviks rejected the idea that individual landowning farmers could bring greater prosperity for everyone. The brutal murder of the entire Romanov family was the culmination of deep discontent across the Russian Empire, with the persistently autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas II. Following the disaster of the First World War and the Tsar's abdication in 1917, Bolshevik revolutionaries took power. The new Soviet Russia was immediately split by a raging civil war, and as royalist sympathizers neared Ekaterinburg, where the Tsar, his wife, and their 5 children were being held, the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin ordered their execution. On the 17th of July 1918, all 7 royals were shot, and their bodies were then secretly buried. DNA testing has confirmed the remains of all 7 members of the imperial family. Tsar Nicholas II had reigned as the absolute ruler of the Russian Empire since 1894. Economic problems, societal changes, and a significant growth in the population, which resulted in land shortages, all combined to inspire certain groups to demand reforms. The Tsar barely escaped being toppled by the Russian Revolution of 1905. The massacre of unarmed known as Bloody Sunday in 1905 kicked off a series of statewide strikes and protests that year, which were supported by all classes of Russian society. The Tsar's half-hearted attempts at political reforms, with a new representative parliament, his choice of reactionary ministers, and the lack of significant success concerning the Stolypin Reforms, that is social, economic and land reforms instituted by the Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, meant that revolutionary sentiments continued to bubble under the surface of Russia's autocratic rule. Assassinations, including that of Stolypin in 1911, and activism by communist groups like the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, kept the idea of change at the forefront of Russian politics. Another source of criticism towards Nicholas II was the mysterious role of the self-proclaimed holy man Grigory Rasputin, and the question of just how much influence this Siberian peasant had on the royal family. Although the Russian peasantry still widely respected the sanctity of the Tsar's role, Russia's entry into the First World War was disastrous for Nicholas II and proved to be the last straw for the revolutionaries. Once again, as had been the case following the humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, Nicholas was exposed as an incompetent war leader, even if he himself had been reluctant to enter this particular conflict. Nicholas's decision to take over as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces in September 1915 meant that he became closely associated with Russia's military failures. These failures included calamitous defeats on the battlefield, disastrous logistical incompetence, and the deaths of over 2 million Russian soldiers. WWI also caused further woes for the Russian agricultural sector and economy in general. The ultimate result of all of this strife was the Russian Revolution of 1917, which began with bread riots in March 1917, and which quickly escalated when troops of the Petrograd garrison joined the rioters. The revolution and the lack of support for the Tsar amongst the political elite forced Nicholas to abdicate on the 2nd of March. He also abdicated in the name of his son and heir Alexei, still not quite grasping that the Romanovs were about to disappear from history. Nicholas chose his brother to succeed him, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, who reigned for just one day as Tsar Michael II, although he was never officially confirmed as such. The Bolsheviks ensured that the Russian monarchy was effectively abolished. Nicholas was advised to flee the country for his own safety, but he refused, stating, "I'd never leave Russia, I love her too much." Nicholas entertained the idea, rather naively, of living a quiet life of retirement in Crimea or Kostroma, which had historical ties with the ex-Tsar was obliged to relocate to the Tsarskoye Selo Palace, south of St. Petersburg. The family consisted of Nicholas, his wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their son, Alexei. The Romanovs were virtually imprisoned by the provisional government, which had been established on the 11th of March. At first, the confinement was bearable, Nicholas ruefully remarked. "For have I not been a prisoner all my life?" A proposal to the British ambassador that the ex-Tsar and his family would be best served by Britain hosting them. King George V was Nicholas' cousin, was passed on to the British Prime Minister and King, but the plan was ultimately rejected, largely due to George V's concerns that the ex-Tsar's presence might stir up revolutionary thoughts in the minds of British workers. In any case, it is unlikely the Bolsheviks would have allowed the ex-Tsar to live in a country where he might easily gain funds to launch a comeback. Meanwhile, the Romanovs whiled away their time under house arrest by planting vegetables and sunbathing. The seemingly idyllic summer only blighted by a wave of measles amongst the children. On the 1st of August, the royal family was moved to Tobolsk, in Siberia. After the 5-day train journey, the Romanovs, their dogs, and 39 retainers were housed in the modest governor's mansion in Ironically, this mansion, which had a constant guard of soldiers, was called Freedom House. Confined to the mansion's garden, the Romanovs passed the time playing dominoes en basset, watching curious passers-by, and writing letters. Alexandra wrote in one letter, "All the past is a dream. One keeps only tears and grateful memories. One by one all earthly things slip away." Following the Second Revolution, Soviet Russia was established on the 7th of November. With the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin at its head, Lenin negotiated a ceasefire with Germany in December 1917 and formally withdrew Russia from WWI with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on the 3rd of March 1918. At the end of April, the Romanov family was moved to a new residence at Ekaterinburg, a Bolshevik stronghold. Here at Ipatev House, the mansion of a local merchant, the royal family was subjected to food rationing and limited time for walking in the garden, but they remained together until the end. To keep out prying eyes, the house was fenced off and its windows whitewashed. As Alexandra wrote in her last letter, "I have come here, knowing quite well that I shan't escape with my life. Though the storm is coming nearer and nearer, our souls are at peace." Almost immediately after seizing power, Lenin and his fellow Bolsheviks became embroiled in a long and bloody civil war. The Russian Civil War involved several competing groups, notably the Bolsheviks. The whites dominated by conservative elements of the army and with support from Russia's disappointed allies in WWI, and various separatist movements involving states who wanted to break free from the Russian Empire and who had the support of the Central Powers, with the Civil War going badly for them. The Bolsheviks were determined that Nicholas II did not become a rallying point for the opposition. Significantly, the ex-Tsar was now directly addressed as Citizen Romanov, and the Bolshevik code name for his family was the Baggage. The matter came to a head when a pro-white Czech force took over Simbirsk and advanced towards Ek. Lenin gave his approval for local Bolsheviks at 8. On the 16th of July 1918, Lenin stated that the plan to execute the entire family was simplicity to the point of genius, and justified the murder with his belief that revolution is meaningless without firing squads. Lenin was not alone in his views, and several unofficial plots by local Bolsheviks to murder the Romanovs had already been at the same time. A plan by royalists to spirit away the royal family to the safety of a foreign country was also foiled. Lenin's final decision was not endorsed by all Bolsheviks, though. One notable voice of opposition was that of Leon Trotsky, who had wanted to put the Tsar on trial in order to publicly expose his inadequacies and demonstrate why nothing short of a revolution was deemed necessary. Yakov Yurovsky, a Bolshevik commissar and member of the Czech Lenin's secret police, was the man charged with carrying out the murder of the royal family. Yurovsky had no qualms over his dreadful mission, once stating, "It was left to me, the son of a worker, to settle the revolution's score with the imperial house for centuries of suffering." In the early hours of the 17th of July, the Romanovs and some of their servants were called from their beds and assembled in the mansion's cellar. Yurovsky and 10 or 11 armed men entered the room. Yurovsky asked all to stand and read out a short statement. "In view of the fact that your relatives continue their offensive against Soviet Russia, the Presidium of the Urals Regional Council has decided to sentence you to death." Nicholas responded with, "Lord, oh my God, what is this?" and asked Yurovsky to repeat the statement, which he did. Yurovsky then shot the uncomprehending ex-monarch in the chest, and the other men also fired at him, largely ignoring the rest of the prisoners. Yurovsky then ordered the men to fire on the other Romanovs and servants, but by now the cellar was filled with smoke. A door was opened to clear the air, and the firing continued, as did bloody work using bayonets. The Romanovs had secretly sewn the family jewels into their clothing. Corsets, underwear, belts, hats, and thick seams of any kind hid away a large number of gemstones. A feat of retailoring the family had codenamed arranging the medicines. The jewels sewn into their clothing partially protected the Tsar's children from the initial volleys, and so they had to be shot at point-blank range. The botched bout of butchery took fully 10 minutes before silence finally reigned in the cellar. Even 2 of the family dogs were killed. The bodies were relieved of valuables such as rings, watches, and 17 pounds of jewels. It was noted that the 4 daughters each wore an amulet around their necks, which contained a picture of the hated Rasputin and the words of one of his prayers. The bodies were stripped and thrown into a disused mine shaft. But when this was discovered to be not very deep, the bodies were recovered and treated with gasoline and acid. The remains were then buried in the nearby forest. Other more distant relations of the Tsar were rounded up and executed. Michael Alexandrovich had already been shot. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia since 1613, was at an end. The Bolsheviks officially announced that the Tsar had been killed before Czechoslovak gangs seized it. It was reported that the rest of the imperial family had been evacuated. Lenin made sure that he was not directly implicated in the murder, and the official line was that the Urals Soviet had acted independently, a point most historians consider impossible. There were persistent rumors that Anastasia, the Tsar's youngest daughter, had survived the execution. In 1993, DNA testing of the gravesite confirmed that here lay the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, and Maria. The problem was that Anastasia and Alexasia were missing. The Tsar and his family were reinterred in the Saints Peter and Paul Cathedral of St. Petersburg. In 2000, Nicholas II, his wife, and 5 children were all made saints by the Russian Orthodox Church. In 2007, a second burial site, not far from the main site, was discovered to contain what were possibly the remains of the 2 missing children. Closure finally came in 2015, when DNA testing revealed the human remains at the second site included those of Anastasia. These newly identified remains were then added to the Romanov family tomb in the Saints Peter and Paul Cathedral.